This week, President Donald Trump delivered his first address to a joint session of Congress since his return to the White House, with analysis of the speech and the whirlwind of executive action sweeping through D.C. We're joined by political commentator, senior political editor at The Blaze, Chris Bedford. Chris, thanks for being here. I want to start with the president's speech, that joint session of Congress, the first in his second term. He started on a very optimistic note.
Yes, absolutely. He's got a lot to be proud of in there. This is his first speech before a joint session in 5 years. It's unheard of that an administration that was once there and then was out and now is back. And it was kind of a triumphant return for him. And so much over the last 8 years of his agenda has been laid out before the American people. That's one thing that Democrats and their columnist friends have been unable to push back against. He said exactly what he was going to do when he came into office, and he'd already accomplished more in those first 40-something days than any president since FDR had at the beginning of a term. It was a triumphant tone. It was one that was explaining his vision, and it was also, of course, he mixed in some teasing, some humor, and some of those classics from the president.
Yeah, look, YouGov did that poll of those watching. 71% of people liked what they heard. So that was clearly he struck a chord with the majority of the audience watching. I was struck, Chris, by the Democrat reaction. I mean, there were the paddle protests during the speech, the outburst by Democratic Congressman Al Green, who was thrown out in the middle. We'll give people a sense of that if they didn't see it. Green has been censured by the House, Chris. I happen to think it important to have an opposition party to hold everybody accountable. But that begins with substantive arguments, not stunts. Where is the Democratic Party now? Are they in a position to make a substantive argument?
No, and they haven't made any arguments really on the substance. If you look at where they're fighting, they've been fighting on legality, they've been fighting on process. When you're talking about deportations, they're not out there talking about illegal immigrants and how they are actually Americans too, like we've been subjected to for the last 8 years. They're simply talking about who has the power and who has the control. The same thing is largely true in the transgender issue, where the last 8 years or so we've been subjected to this insanity. Instead, now they're just saying, well, you can't do this. We're going to follow the law. We're going to follow state law. On all of these issues, they're not fighting on the actual issue itself. And that shows you that Democratic Party that's lost in D.C. Now, the governors, on the other hand, you see them kind of moderate their position. Anyone who's serious out there, who actually wants to have a future in American politics, is doing everything they can to remove the stain of the last 5 years from their political records.
The president spoke at length about the economy. Obviously, this is always an important benchmark for any administration. We're only 6 weeks into this new government. Grocery and energy prices have not moved very much. How vital is economic recovery? And will this trade tariff war with Canada, Mexico, I know he put some of those on hold, and with China, will that help or hinder U.S. economic growth in the near term?
In the near term, it's going to hurt. Any kind of a trade war is going to hurt. In his first term, trade war with Canada and blockades over dairy really hit farmers, it hit voters who were Trump supporters. And that's something that you saw from the European Union, from Canada and other countries, as they specifically target in their retaliation people who support Donald Trump. And a lot of that's going to be agriculture and things like that. But the sad reality is the American economy has been taken advantage of for so long that the cure is going to be painful. That's difficult. It's easier for a president who's in his last term to do this, but anything they do to try and reset this trade balance is gonna hurt for a little while. It's probably, I think, it's definitely worthwhile for the long-term health of the economy, but it's almost like resetting a bone.
The president addressed the tensions between the U.S. and Ukraine in his speech, and he quoted from a letter by Vladimir Zelensky following that now famous dust-up in the Oval Office. What do you make of the quick about-face from Ukraine? I mean, they're now saying they want peace, they'll sign the mineral deal. Has the president managed to get Ukraine back to the table?
Absolutely.
And why do you think that is?
Intelligence. I mean, the Europeans can talk about raising an army sometime in the distant future. Ukraine needs that money now. The Europeans can talk about spending more money, but they don't have it, and it's going to threaten their economies. They're already teetering. And at the end of the day, the U.S. cutting off the satellites, the Europeans can't replace that satellite intelligence. They can't replace the surveillance the United States has provided to Ukraine. They simply would literally have to launch a new space program in order to catch up. So when you lose that crucial advantage on the battlefield, or it's suspended for a period of time, you have to come back to the table. Otherwise, Putin's going to end up dictating those terms.
The Supreme Court this week ruled that the Trump administration cannot freeze the $2 billion in funds already allocated to USAID contractors. Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Roberts both sided with the majority in this decision. This will certainly mean, Chris, that the grants received by the Catholic bishops for their migration and refugee service activities will soon be released. Your reaction to that?
It's a disappointing decision that the executive has no control over the executive spending. I think this is an ongoing fight. A lot of this is just being decided around the margins, the technicalities. President Trump is pushing the boundaries here on what has become a completely bloated and out of control government where no one seems responsible except for left-wing nonprofits, et cetera, for actually how this money is spent. And the court seems to side with that, which is strange because Roberts is a strong supporter of executive power. How exactly this is going to play out, how it'll impact the bishops and the money that they have already spent on some of these services, we'll be seeing over the next couple of days.
Yeah, final question. Linda McMahon was just approved as Education Secretary. In one of her first missives to the staff, she encourages them to sort of walk with her on what she calls their final mission. It's believed that that is a subtle reference to the closure of the Education Department, which Trump wants. Your thoughts on that? I mean, this has been talked about since the Reagan administration. Is this a reality? Do you think it'll happen?
I think it'll happen. We'll have to see where it goes with the courts after that. The Department of Education doesn't actually educate anyone, like the Department of Agriculture doesn't actually farm. What they do is they're a grant-giving organization, and they've been using those grants to back left-wing causes and an undermining of American education. It doesn't matter what city you live in. You could live in a prosperous suburb or a poor neighborhood, and either way, your children are less well-educated than they were years ago. Obviously, something has to change, and I think he's actually got the politics on his side on this one, which where the law will come down is going to be this is unprecedented territory.
Chris Bedford, we'll leave it there. You can read Chris's columns at theblaze.com. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.